is I'm sure just like everybody else, there's the dream amount and then the point where you go, okay, we can make it work for this amount.
Yeah.
And I'm curious at what point you make that distinction for, okay, we can go now.
That's a really difficult question that you face every time you make a film, because typically you do overestimate in the ask and you get less. And so what you have to do is know in your mind how much money you need to make the film you promised to make, because you're still making a promise to your clients, your distributor, your broadcaster, and if you under-deliver on that promise, you're done, right? It's so important as you build a production company that every one of your productions be a success. You can't afford to have projects that are seen as under-delivering. You know, if you look at the industry from the point of view of the commissioning editors representing the broadcasters, it's all about risk management. They're going out to marketplaces, they're trying to acquire or produce or co-produce projects, a certain number of projects to fill their slate every year, and they're managing risk the whole time. And so if you turn on them and you deliver something that lets them down and makes their situation untenable, it's the kiss of death for you as a producer, right? So I think it's very important to know in your mind what the minimum required money is to make a film, and if you're not getting enough, step back. Stop there. And I have known producers over the years who had a different approach, who would just make the damn film no matter what, and I think that can be really self-destructive. I think every successful producer has projects that they themselves pulled the plug on because they didn't feel they had the resources to do the subject justice. So in the case of EQUUS, there were some white knuckle moments. Well, I don't think you need the arcane details, but anyway, we missed a deadline, CBC missed a deadline, we missed a deadline, we didn't get some of the CMF money from the regional fund, and so we went into production about $300,000 short, which
Substantial.
kept me up at night.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. But as I said before, we had access, we had the broadcasters wanting the film at a certain delivery date, and you know, all the ingredients were there, and I thought, we'll find this money. The first thing we did for this project in August 2016 was fly to Kazakhstan and film in an archaeological dig. I knew that there was a very promising archaeological site that had been opened in the 1980s. It had been excavated, I mean, you know about this, the Bowtie site. It had been excavated in the 80s, and there was evidence that these could have been the earliest people ever to domesticate horses. 5 bodies had been discovered at this site over the years. They'd all been sent to Moscow and St. Petersburg as things were done in the Soviet period, and they'd all been lost in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that they were all lost before we discovered how to work with ancient DNA.
That's so brutal. They just lost? Like science's next discovery is
Yeah.
just lost?
Yeah,
Okay.
shoe boxes of bones in the dumpster, literally, right? That kind of thing. This is what happened when the Soviet Union fell apart. So I knew who the scientist was. He was still alive, teaching in a little regional university in northern Kazakhstan, and I wrote him a letter. I actually wrote him a letter and said, this is my email address. If you have email me. And we got to the stage when we were still developing this project where it was clear to me he could organize a field season, and he thought it was promising. He thought he would find human remains, quite potentially find human remains. And so without any financing, without even a short form in place, I said, okay, we're going to find the money in the West, and you're going to do this. So I called a couple of scientists we'd worked with on different projects over the years and said, okay, I'm going to throw in $2,000, you throw in $2,000, you throw in $2,000, and we'll do this. And they opened up a site for a 3-month period, which was more than they'd done in years. And in June, we got the call that they had found what looked like a cranium. And I said, okay, cover it up. That's what you do in archaeology. And you find something, you're not ready to lift it, you just cover it with dirt and wait until the
This
conditions.
is very exciting. Like the film inspired actual
Yeah,
discovery.
I mean, all this stuff is boring, but now we're talking about the fun stuff. But you know, it's clear. It's important to know that we didn't have the money yet. I just thought, boy, if we do find something here, this is going to be that unique access the broadcaster wants to hear about, right? And so I called Eske Villeslev, the Danish geneticist. He is one of those people who can find and sequence ancient DNA, and a team in Exeter. We all arranged to be at this site in August with our cameras, and they opened up the site. It was a full human skeleton, the first human skeleton discovered at Bowtie in the last 15 years. And they lifted it. And this is a key sequence in our documentary, and it turned into 2 Nature articles a year later.
Oh, wow.
So, okay, coming back to the problem of not having $300,000 of financing. When I was in Kazakhstan, I realized the horse is everything to these people. It's on the flag. It's the national symbol of Kazakhstan. And if any country wants to celebrate the domestication of the horse, it's Kazakhstan. And the horse was domesticated in Kazakhstan 6,000 years ago. So even though they have, it's a totalitarian semi-dictatorship, and they have one state broadcaster, I thought, you know, this idea might just go. And there's a lot of oil money in Kazakhstan. So I traveled to Kazakhstan 5 times over the following fall and winter and spring. In the middle of the winter, I managed to get a meeting with the Minister of Culture, and you know, it was a very neo-Soviet situation. It was this huge office and this long table, and then his table at the end, and all of his telephones, right? And each telephone was a different color, and it went to a different.
The Minister of Culture.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Absolutely. And he said to me, "I have 4 minutes," when I walked in the door, and it was like 9 o'clock at night, and I was jet lagged. And I sat down and I said, "Kazakhstan is the cradle of horsepower. This is where horsepower came from, and horsepower changed our world, made the world we live in. And it's a story that Kazakhstan wants to tell, and it has nothing to do with Borat." And Borat is an important thing to bring up and use in Kazakhstan. And so this 4-minute conversation turned into a half-hour conversation, and he picked up the phone and he called the guy who runs the state broadcaster, and he said, I've got some Canadians over here, I'm going to send them over, and I just want you to do this project. He hung it up, and I walked out the door and I walked to the broadcaster. And so I flew home with that $300,000
That's
check.
amazing.
Yeah. So I don't know.
I just want you to do this project.
I don't know if that's a cautionary tale or if it's an inspirational tale. I really, I mean, do what you want with that information. But I will say that EQUUS was hard to finance, and we pre-sold this in every way we could, to every territory we could, to get enough money to make the film we wanted to make. And you know, of course, the consequence of that is there's no profit in the end. But
Yeah.
we made the film that we wanted to make.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, that takes us.
Is that all the budget?
I
wanna
think
talk
that
about?
nicely kind of covers what we were what we talked about talking about.
Do we want to ask for questions about budget
Yeah.
before we move on to story?
Maybe that's a good idea. Do you guys have questions about financing structure, questions about budget? Niobe has said that he's willing to say no if he can't answer it, so you might as well ask. And yeah, anybody out there?
Yeah, first of all, hugely inspiring to hear all of this, and especially to hear kind of the passion behind the business side of things. I'm curious, you talk about pre-financing. How many times have you been in a situation where you couldn't convince a potential broadcaster based on an idea alone, but how often are producers in situations where they have to finish the product or have a rough cut of a project in order to finish the film, and how risky is that in order to convince them that you have something worthwhile?
Well, you're really, I think, asking about a scenario where you're making the film and then selling it as an acquisition at the end.
First and asking questions later.
Well, In the old-fashioned world of television licenses, that doesn't work because there are different amounts you get for a commission, like a license, a pre-sale, and an acquisition. And the amount you get for a license is up here, the amount you get for a pre-sale is here, and the amount you get for an acquisition is down here. So you'll never pay off your investment if you wait till the acquisition stage. That's the world of conventional broadcasters. The world of the new subscription VOD platforms is different. So, you know, it's very possible for you to finance your project and sell it to Netflix for the amount that you spent on it or more. If anyone knows Chasing Coral, which is a very successful documentary last year, that was self-financed by the filmmaker. It won at Sundance, and Netflix signed a deal with them at Sundance for just over $1 million US. So not very much money. I mean, that thing cost $1 million to make. So I would say that that approach is a really risky one. And the first project I was ever involved with, I was still a grad student, was produced by someone here in Edmonton. There was interest from CETA. There was no broadcast interest. The producer financed 2 shooting expeditions to Siberia, spent $80,000 on it, never found a broadcaster, went out of business, declared bankruptcy. His footage is at the archives, and he drives a Zamboni. So, you know, that was the first encounter I had ever had with the risks of producing, and it taught me to not go into production until you have the money. On the other hand, as you get more experienced and your relationships with broadcasters and funding sources get better, I think you get better at judging what is acceptable risk. And there's always some level of risk, and I just told you about a situation where there is risk. But I think generally speaking, it's really important to hold off spending too much of your own money until you have an actual commitment from a broadcaster. There was a question back there?
What's the conventional way to open up the discussion with countries about like the international pre-sales? It seems like the Kazakhstan one, it's a pretty cool story, but maybe not the most conventional way of doing that.
So the way it works for me is I find an anchor broadcaster here in Canada. The hardest deal to get is the first deal. So with a Nature of Things or a TVO or a Knowledge Network license, whatever it is, in hand, then you start your discussions with foreign broadcasters. It's really not possible to be at a marketplace event and pitch to a foreign broadcaster successfully without having something in your pocket already. Those broadcasters who don't know who you are going to be looking for some kind of assurance that you're the real thing. And the best way to assure them is to say, we're making this film here in Canada, right? So let's say you're at a marketplace. Let's say it's Banff or Hot Docs or the World Congress of Science and Factual Producers, Real Screen, you name it. You're going to be meeting usually in a speed dating setting with Swedes and French and Australians. So they're going to want to know some things very quickly. They're going to want to know the elevator pitch for your story, and they're going to want to know that there's already some commitment. And then you would say, I'm looking for pre-sales to finish financing. We're 70% of the way there. We have really good film funding in Canada. Apart from the broadcaster, we have a provincial fund, we have the Canadian Media Fund. So we only need a little bit more money to make this happen, and we think it would work for you because there's a great Australian character in this film. Or, you know, you guys like stuffy animals, or whatever you've got to find some kind of common language with them and know what they're looking for.
It is not Borat.
There you go. Yeah, this is not Borat. So that's what I would say. The most important thing is to start your financing here at home and then move outwards. There's one more question. Oh, there's a whole bunch. Fred?
Yeah. In terms of like getting ready to pitch the project and then in development, then in production, what does the size of the producing / business affairs team look like? How many people do you have? And what are the major roles that you need for a project of this size?
Well, I find that I need to have one experienced business affairs person. So of course we have a bookkeeper and we have an accountant and we have a lawyer, and all of those people can be called upon on an hourly basis. But you need to have, I find, you need to have one person who is working full time, preparing your budgets with you, packaging all of the different elements you need to put into a CMF application or an Alberta Film Fund application. We're a small film company, so we're making 1 to 2 projects at a time, and I have one person, Sandra Tober, on full-time at my office. I don't think you need more than that. I mean, if you're a producer yourself, right? But I also find that if you're doing it alone, it is a full-time, that is a full-time job. And I mean, you might have that experience, Fred, and I know other producers in town who don't have a full-time Sandra, who do all of this. Rosie Dransfeld, for example, often does all of this stuff herself when she's in the development phase of a project. But just be aware, it's a ton of work, and partly it's someone to do that work, and partly it's that experience. So the funding process is very tied to deadlines, and there are so many interlocking deadlines. Each one of these funding sources has deadlines, and you can't go to one source before you've gone to another in many cases. So you can't go to the CMF English Regional Production Bonus on April 1st unless you're fully financed and have a CMF agreement in place. And you need to know when to start the process with the CMF to get to the point where you can ask for the regional bonus. And it's a single pot of money, and once it's exhausted, it's gone. So typically it's gone by the end of the day on April 1st or whenever they open it, right?
Wow.
So that's all a way of saying it's really helpful to have someone who knows those things.
Does the number of business affairs people change as the production ramps up, or is it basically she's just dedicated, she's taking care of the production?
Yeah, we found that one person can handle this with bookkeeping support. We have a production coordinator on staff when we go into production, and that person is handling a lot of the things that relate to the business affairs person's job. So on the legal side, releases and permissions. On the business side, receipts, invoices, that kind of thing. But we bring a production coordinator on for only a period of time during the most intensive production phase of a project, and not during post.
And then how many producers do you have working on a project like this? And is it just one, or do you have an army of them?
No,
How
one.
does that sort of shape up?
One.
Just one?
I'm the producer.
And director?
Yeah.
How do you manage that?
Well, it's just something that I've gotten used to as we've grown from project to project. I suppose there are, I mean, you're doing episodic stuff, right? So there could be projects that are just so big that it would be too much for one producer. But the job of the producer going into production is financing. The job of the producer during the production is deciding how that money gets spent and controlling costs. So, you know, once the train is rolling down the tracks, it's not a full-time job in my experience, as long as you have that support.
On that structure, so my understanding is before my time, the Alberta Media Fund was designed, and tax credit programs were designed to actually fill the gaps between productions when you needed to do development. So the money never came, it didn't come in before you made the movie, came in after you made the movie to keep you solvent until you're ready to make the next one. Now that the funding is getting incorporated into the budget as one of the revenue sources, how do you decide at what essentially you save to live off of in the in-between?
Well, it's very difficult for filmmakers to go to the bank and get a line of credit because your income goes like this, right? Yeah, there's the producer fee. So if you're the producer fee is the last thing that comes in the door if you've run the project successfully, and that would be what you'd live on in the interim. But of course, you also want to treat that as your retained earnings or your profit as you grow a company. So if you just eat your producer fee, you're kind of back where you started with one more film in your back pocket. So what I find, and I think this must be typical with filmmakers, is that as you're making a film, you're thinking about the next one. You're always thinking about the next film or the next project. And so usually in the past, I've already been putting pitches in the post-production phase of my current project. And that's just natural. The thing is, when you're doing the big whales like this one here, it usually there's a long development period, and in my case, I just have to use what resources I've saved to get through that period. Sometimes we take development financing, but I don't like to do it because it's money you spend that then you have to give back on the first day of production, right? So it actually comes out of your project. And it's possible, I think, to develop a project well without spending that much money. And it's a big paperwork hassle to do a development phase.
So all those trips to meet your characters and the trips for the $1,000 cups of coffee, like you're just funding, that's out of your own pocket or out of the business's sort of slush fund? Or?
Yeah, so we have a production company, and every time we do a large project, we start another company. So every film is its own company, and that's a requirement. That your various funders will require you to do that. So the parent company will, over the years, be getting distribution revenues from past films, retransmission fees from past films. They'll be getting the producer fees, which come in a long time after a film is produced. And in my experience, over the years, you get more and more financial momentum. And I wouldn't say we're a highly profitable company, but it's given us the security to do that spending between projects. And so I like to work hard, spend what it takes to do the development, and then get into production as quickly as we can with good research behind us. That's our business model. Between The Great Human Odyssey, which was a 3-part series, and EQUUS Story of the Horse, which is a 3-part series, I actually worked for another producer, Rosie Dransfeld, as a director making a film, and that's how I made ends meet as I developed EQUUS Story of a Horse. That was a film about organ transplants. Yeah. So
Memento Mori. Well, it had 3 names. It was there were 3 different deliverables. But anyway, okay. Yeah. Any more questions about finance? Yes.
I guess this kind of touches on finance, but also your future and talking about the Great Human Odyssey. What is your Great Odyssey? What do you want to become? What is your future goal? How do you envision your future?
You're skipping way ahead. We still have 2 more segments.
Does that mean I can spend the next hour thinking about that?
Yes. We'll come back to that. We'll come back to it.
Okay. Thank you for the most difficult question of the evening.
Scott, we've got...
Question about the past. What was your first film like? Did you make any big mistakes, big expensive mistakes just from oversight or something like that? Because you came out of university and not trained in film, and then you became a filmmaker. What was that segue like?
Well, there are 2 very valuable lessons that I got taught early in my career. The first one was when I was still a PhD student, and that was that film that went nowhere. It was just so intoxicating for this producer-director pair here in Edmonton to get access to this forbidden world, this closed military zone in the Siberian Arctic that was run by a Russian oligarch named Roman Abramovich, that they forgot to have a story. Right, and they really thought, how can people not want this documentary? But in the end, there was no documentary. It had no story, and that led to the bankruptcy of the producer. The other lesson was I was still at the university, and so I had a postdoc salary, and I was part-time working on a film about the tar sands, and it was for a producer in Toronto, White Pine Pictures. And the relationship was so antagonistic and abusive. You know, we'd get these weekly calls, my director here and I, with the producer in Toronto.
You were the line producer here?
I was the researcher, but I really ended up, it was just a team of 2, and I did access and research, and I was on all the locations. It was a great learning opportunity. But the bastard in Toronto was so awful to us. It's a story for drinks, but I realized I don't ever want to work for another producer. I want to be my own producer. If I'm going to direct a film and care about it, I also want to own it. And so that's why I started a production company after I left the university. So they weren't failures, but boy, they were good lessons to learn early in my career.
Okay.
Miles?
Okay. No, go Miles, because you were before.
Okay. So
I just wanted to ask about the relationship between like you and the broadcaster or whoever you're pitching to kind of find the funding.
Yeah.
'Cause like you were saying, it's kind of this tumultuous relationship that's built on them risking that they're going to get a good film and
Yeah.
you're delivering it. And a lot of it is trial and error when you're learning to kind of like learn how to budget, learn how to pitch, learn how to make these relationships. So where do you go to kind of gain experience? Like sessions like this are fantastic.
Mhm.
Thank you for taking the time. But how do you kind of level yourself up between the films so that you're not making the same mistakes or you are growing the films?
Yeah. Well, if it's a great question, Miles. If the first thing to say is you can't make a mistake or you won't get a second chance, then you realize what a dilemma you're in as an emerging producer. It's very difficult. So no matter how risk averse the broadcaster is, the commissioning editor is, they're still looking for great stories, right? So what you need to look for is a unique story, a story that they just have to have no matter what. Even though you don't have any experience, you've got the story. And so that's often about unique character or location access, right? And I think you have to be really brutal with yourself. If you're sitting in a story that you like, but it's very much like other stories, I mean, anyone could develop this, then it's probably not the one that's going to break through with the broadcaster. As an emerging filmmaker, you have to have something special. So you can sit down and pitch with your unique story, your unique access. You can also show it. So you can, if you've got the skills, shoot demo material, a sizzler, something like that. And that's even better. I mean, if you're going to someone with a story they can't resist and showing that you actually have the creative and technical nous to pull it off, that's another piece of risk they can take off the table, right? So it's just really important, I think, to go into these marketplaces, which are intimidating environments, and understand what the commissioning editor is experiencing. I mean, they're under a lot of pressure. Every season they've got number targets. It's a very difficult place to work at a modern broadcaster. They've got to go into this pit like Banff and have a whole bunch of conversations and come away with some stories. So they have a job to do, and you can help them do that job. You just have to give them what they need. Right? And I often, I have drinks with commissioning editors. I didn't used to have drinks, now I have drinks with commissioning editors because you develop these relationships, right? And they say, it's just, why do these filmmakers come to me with these ideas that, they know someone's made this film. And, it's just not original. So they're experiencing this frustration. So take that and apply that filter to the ideas you're developing. It's hard, and it's especially hard in Edmonton because we don't have a large film production community. In a place like Toronto or Vancouver, there are all kinds of producers who can take you in, and they want to grow, so they want to add people to their staff, and they're willing to go to a marketplace with you. We don't have very many people in Edmonton who are willing to fly an emerging producer around the world and stand next to them as they pitch. And that's a really important opportunity that will get you in the door as an emerging producer. So it's hard.
Yeah, I was going to say, just building on that, is there any advantages that you've noticed being from Edmonton that maybe people in Toronto would miss?
Yep, there are.
Yeah.
They're not written, but there are quotas. All the broadcasters need to show that they're working with producers across the country, especially the public broadcasters. So we have what's seen as a relatively thin film community or documentary community in Alberta compared to what you see in Toronto, for example. And so there are fewer Alberta producers going to those meetings with good ideas. So I think that's an advantage. The Alberta Film Fund has always been a real advantage, and that's why we're worried about what could happen to it. But another thing there is that from the very first day, I always went to the best marketplaces in the world. So I started at IDFA in Amsterdam. I mean, if you want to make documentaries, I would suggest that you go to IDFA and Hot Docs and spend the money and go into the pitch forum. Don't just nibble around the edges. Go to the pitch forum and see the 20 documentaries that are going to be the biggest documentaries 2 years down the road get pitched and go down in flames. you have to get into those settings.
Obviously, you got a relationship with CBC and Nature Things, but where would you go if maybe your quota was full for the next 3 years? What are the next tiers or options out there for this type of sort of factual program?
Okay, so I'm a science and nature filmmaker, science and nature documentary filmmaker. So I have a limited number of places I can go. So for those kinds of documentaries, there are plenty of strands outside the country, in the States, for example. But if we talk about Canada, it's very thin. There's Knowledge Network in BC and TVO in Ontario. And both of those can work with filmmakers who aren't in their own provinces. Sometimes it's in exceptional circumstances, but they can do it. They'll do it. There are specialty channels with which I'm less familiar and where the budgets are a little lower, but certainly, you can go to the Wild TVs of the world, and it's just that the money's not great, right? I think Telus Optic is a good starting point, but you can't really build a company on Telus Optic grants. So very soon you're out of choices in Canada, and you've got to go to international broadcasters. So it depends on the nature of your idea. If you're me, then you would be going to Nova at PBS, Nature at PBS, the Smithsonian Channel, Nat Geo. Nat Geo has a whole bunch of different channels. There's different people to talk to there. The Discovery Network, as stupid as they are, sometimes they do good stuff. Those are the broadcasters in the States that are available. And Canadians can do direct deals with them. It's just that you're not going to have copyright. And then there's all the Europeans. So when I go to the World Congress or Sunny Side of the Docks, I'll typically have meetings with a bunch of Americans and a bunch of Europeans, and maybe someone from Australia. So some of those strands will do a deal directly with you. So for example, Arte in France can commission your project. Some of them can do that, some of them can't do that. The nature of things has to work with only Canadian producers. That's part of its mandate. So if they ever work with an international team, it has to be an international co-production team, right? I just mention that because some of the broadcasters in Europe are under the same requirements, where for them to work with you, you'd have to have a partner in France or Sweden or England. But because the pickings are so slim in Canada, that's why it's important to get into those international marketplaces. Once you pay your money and you get the big book or now the online directory, you can see who's coming and you can see what they're looking for, and you can arrange those meetings.
Okay, I'm going to stop us right there. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and I promise there will be more time for questions later. So just save them if you've got more. So we'll be back at 7:45 sharp. To Kazakhstan, it's just, you're running all over